This week, we're entering the fantastical realm of reading. We're going to be talking about allegories and magical realism and why these tools are going to help you understand the deeper meaning of great literature. Let's get into it. Welcome to this week's episode of the Read Well podcast. My name is Eddie Hood, and I'm your host, where I believe it's more important to read well than to be well read. So grab your favorite book, open up your notes, and let's get ready to learn something fascinating. Hey all, welcome back to this week's episode of the Read Well podcast. This is Eddie Hood, and I hope you've had a wonderful week. I have just been busy like crazy. My house has been rumbling with chaos. I've got a son who's graduating high school right now, and another one who's in college learning how to be an airline pilot, and just lots of stuff happening. And it seems like life just never ends. And this is why I love this podcast. It's a chance for me to hang out with each of you and talk about books. So let's get into it. Let's talk about some books. Now, before we do, I just want to share with you a quick testimonial I got this week from a member of my private reading community, which you can join if you'd like. You just go to the readwellpodcast.com, and then up in the top navigation bar there, you can join. You just go to Book Club. You'll click on that. It'll tell you everything about our book club. And then you can, if you so choose, join the group. This is from Tammy, though. She says, I'm almost done binging the podcast. Thank you, Tammy. She says, ironically, I'm at the one that said to stop listening and start reading. I am an English teacher, judge typos harshly, and I feel affirmed in my close reading work I do with my kids. I feel affirmed for analyzing great essays. However, I am loving this reading slowly and doing work for myself. It, like I, needed the permission to take notes and do the work for my own knowledge, not just for a lesson plan. She says, I'm reading The Invisible Hour by Alice Hoffman, and now I'm taking notes about what I love. Fiction books that mention other books and that have an intertextual relationship. I have 4 note cards, she says with an exclamation point, which is really great. She says, I can't wait. I just need to set up the system. I'm so grateful for this community. I needed this. Thank you. Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Tammy. That really meant a lot to me this week to see a message like that come through. In fact, I'm getting messages like this almost on a daily basis now. And it means the world to me that you're giving me the opportunity to talk about fiction and reading slowly and things that I love. And I'm so glad that it's resonating with some of you. I'd like to talk about allegory and magical realism. Now, this is an interesting topic for me because I, if you know anything about me, have been an accountant for over 20 years now. This is what I do by day. I count numbers and help people with their finances. And you know what? Doing that for so long, living in Excel spreadsheets and, living in bank statements and what have you, you tend to see the world in a black and white sort of viewpoint. I think that's why I love books so much, because it helps me see some of the gray in between. But I've got to be honest. If I am going to make a confession here, I am terrible at allegory and magical realism. And what that means is that when something is presented in a story that isn't black and white, that is instead sort of trying to convey a deeper meaning or message, it often flies right over my own head. I have to spend a lot of time with the book, considering what the different elements mean, what the symbolism means, and I have to do some journaling and go for a walk before these ideas really click with me. So I've had a chance this week I'm going back to college to study philosophy and English. I'm getting a major in philosophy and a minor in English literature. Well, in one of my classes, I'm taking an introduction to literary fiction. We talked about allegory and magical realism this week, and it helped me so much I wanted to share it with you. So first, let's start off with what it means to consider an allegory. What is an allegory? Well, an allegory is often a story that takes an element, something that you're familiar with, and uses that to convey a deeper message, usually something that is political or moral. Now, there are 2 terms here we should be aware of in the world of allegories. There is something called the tenor and something called the vehicle. Now, the tenor is the message being conveyed. It is the thing we're trying to get across to the reader. And the vehicle is the tool we're using to convey that message, right? So it is the part of the story that is the physical representation, the thing that the story is about. And why does all this matter? Well, because often authors are using these tools to convey deeper messages, and if you're not aware of them, they might just fly over your head, and you might completely miss the deeper layer and the beauty that exists in the story that you're reading. Now, a great example that's very explicit in the world of allegory is something that was written thousands of years ago by the man, the myth, the legend himself, Plato. So whether you like Plato or not, I think he had a lot of great ideas and some crazy ones, as most humans have. But he came up with a story called The Allegory of the Cave, and it is a wonderful example of how we can use elements to convey a deeper meaning. And I'm not going to tell you the entire allegory of the cave because it is somewhat extensive and there are many elements to it. But instead, I would encourage you to just Google, on YouTube, for example, Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and you can watch depictions of this. But here is the main concept. In a cave, there are many prisoners who are chained to a wall, and they can only look towards a specific wall. They can't look behind them. And on this wall is being projected a light with shadows. And in the shadows, there are puppets and images of trees and birds and these kinds of things. So pretend that you've played puppet shadows in the dark before, right? You hold up a flashlight and you make a bird with your hands. All they can see is the light and the shadow. Now, behind these prisoners, there are people who have behind them a fire, and they're holding up different symbols and sticks and fingers and what have you to convey these images. All these prisoners know are the shadows on the wall. So far, so good. That's something you can relate to because as a child, at least, you have sat in the dark and done this with yourself. You can relate to it. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. One of the prisoners is let go. He is allowed to leave the cave and go outside. Now, if he's been living in this cave his entire life and knows nothing different, and he goes outside for the first time and opens his eyes, and he can see not just the shadow of a tree or the shadow of a bird, but to see the real representation of a tree and a bird, and see the world as it is, he is now, for the first time in his life, really seeing reality as it is. And this is something you can identify with, right? And there is more to this story, but I'm going to stop here. What we're talking about is the understanding that each of us needs to open our eyes and begin to ask critical questions to see the greater reality. And if we're going back to our tools, the tenor is that, right? The tenor is that we're all born blind and we have to go through a process of escaping our cave and getting out into the sunshine and seeing what's really out there by asking questions and learning for ourselves. And the vehicle that Plato used, of course, is the cave and the shadows and the light source. So this is an allegory, and next time you read a book, you'll probably run into many of them. Authors use them all of the time. And your job is to be looking out for them and then to hit pause and say, oh, okay. The author is clearly trying to use some object or tool to convey something else. What is it? And a great example of this, if you're in my book club right now, we're reading Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Idiot. It's a fantastic book, but it is chock full of allegories where the main character, Prince Mishkin, is symbolically supposed to be a Christ-like figure amidst the world of rabble, right? All these people who are greedy and stealthy and vicious and what have you. And there's this big interplay of how they interact with each other. Lots of allegory takes place in The Idiot. Well, okay, so let's go to the next idea. We talked about allegory. Now let's talk about magical realism. This is something that really gained hold in Latin America in the early 1900s with several different authors. Now, there are many people who have sort of contributed to the movement of magical realism, but one of the sort of forefathers of this style is a man named Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He lived from 1927 to 2014 and just had a sort of a wonderful impact on how this sort of genre works. Now, here's the idea. We're going to set this story in a very mundane situation, the everyday life. And in this setting, we're going to present some sort of magical element, something that is otherworldly or just out there, right? But we're going to present it in such a way that you as the reader start to feel like it's almost normal, like it's supposed to be an element of the story. And we're going to use that element of the story, that magical element, to convey a deeper meaning. This is why we tacked on the term realism to magical, because when people hear the word magical, they think it's just a book of fantasy or a book of, gnomes and dwarves and wizards and what have you, all of which are great. But magical realism is not that. It's about showing you how the sublime of life can come out of the reality of life. To give you a quick sense of what this is, I just got done reading a story by Gabriel Garcia Marquez titled A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. And if you choose to read it, I'm sure you can find it online, but here's the gist of the story. A husband and wife are in their dilapidated home, and what's happening is there's sort of this infestation of crabs, right? There are crabs everywhere for whatever reason, much like there are whatever plague, can sort of attack a village. For them, it's crabs. They're all over the place. They crawl into the yards, and they're just constantly trying to get rid of them in their house. Well, while the old man is doing this, he is out in his yard whacking away at these crabs, and he sees in the corner of his yard this really old man lying in the mud, and it's raining and it's dark. And as he goes up to this figure, he sees that this man has really big wings. He runs into the house, he gets his wife, he brings her out, and they just stare at this man in the mud he's very old and he's tattered and his wings are destroyed, and he just is, he's otherworldly. He is clearly not human, and so they don't really know what to do, and they seek help from local spiritual leaders and what have you, who say that he's an angel, possibly a fallen angel. And what happens is word gets out that this couple has an angel in their backyard, and so they put him in the chicken coop. They don't know what else to do with him, so they stick him in the chicken coop. And this old man with enormous wings doesn't fight back, doesn't talk to them, doesn't acknowledge them. He just sort of hangs out in the chicken coop. Well, the whole community comes out to see what's going on, of course. And the point of this story that Gabriel Garcia Marquez is trying to convey is what human beings are actually like in the face of spirituality. So here's what happens. As all of these people begin to show up, they all sort of exhibit different emotional responses to this angel. Some of them turn to him for their needs. Maybe they're blind or they're deaf or they have some sort of deformity, and they ask him to heal them. So some people come as a worshiping thing, and it's very supernatural, right? It's all about me, and what do I need? Some people come and they mock the angel. They throw food at him and they poke him. They burn him with like a cattle prodding iron and so on. The point is that everybody comes to this angel or this fallen man in a way that self-serves them. Now, the entire time, you've got this husband and wife who are not just letting this happen. Of course, what do? Well, they erect a fence around their yard and they begin charging admission for people to come and poke and prod the angel. So as the entire community comes and continues to pay this money, this husband and wife, they build up a nice sum and are able to buy a beautiful home and all sorts of things, right? So I won't ruin the story for you much beyond that, but here's the point again. Marquez is trying to show us that as humans, we can kind of be nasty sometimes, right? We are often self-serving and we are faithless and we are whatever. He is trying to show us at our core what we can be animalistically, and he's probably calling us to try and be something higher than that, higher in terms of like human nature. I'd like to take just a second to hit pause on this show to tell you about the readwellpodcast.com. If you go there, you can subscribe to my weekly newsletter on reading deeply. Simply go to thereadwellpodcast.com, enter your email, and I'll send you a message every Wednesday at 9 a.m. on how to become a deep and thoughtful reader. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the show. So this is a good example of magical realism, right? It's taking the mundane everyday life, adding a sense of the mystical, and then teaching you a bigger lesson about it. And it's this really great genre that I'm now getting into, and I'd like to make this week's book recommendation one of magical realism. So let's get into it. This week I got to read a fantastic book, something I wouldn't normally have read. It's very much outside of my sort of circumscribed view of books, and I think it's just because as readers we get into a pattern. And what I have been teaching on this podcast is something I'm trying to get better at myself, which is to read outside of your worldview, read outside of your culture, read outside of the genres you're used to, read widely, but do so in a way that allows you to appreciate other people's forms of living. So the book I had a chance to read this week, it was a lot of fun. And now this is a work of fiction, although it reads a lot like an autobiography or a memoir or something similar. It is a work of fiction, but it is called The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. And this book is written by a man named Junot Diaz, Junotdiaz. Junot Diaz, and it's just this incredible book. Here's the idea behind the brief, wondrous life of Oscar Wilde. It's not just a story of Oscar. Really, it's a story of Oscar's family as they live under the regime of the dictator Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. And it covers a pretty large span of time from the early 1900s up until the 1990s as you go through the different generations of this family. Oscar is, in fact, of course, the main character. And if I could just sort of paint a picture for you of him, he is this young man who is hopeless. He is just the ultimate sort of sci-fi, fantasy, fiction, loves all of that stuff, sort of geeky, nerdy kid who is never going to get a girlfriend, who is extremely overweight, and who is just really struggling with self-confidence. And this clashes with the stereotypical Dominican Republic man who is suave and sexual and debonair and, gets along well with the ladies and all that stuff. He is at complete odds with his male gender. So part of this story, you're wondering if Oscar's ever going to get a girlfriend, right? That's a part of the crux. Because this takes place in part in the Dominican Republic, as well as in New Jersey, depending on what time frame you're in, because the family does move around. You stay inside the Dominican Republic culture the entire time, though. And as the author points out, it is a very sexually driven culture. For the young men and the young women, it is all about being out there and, just having G is what he calls it, having game. So the men have to have game in order to get these women. Now here's why I liked this story, and then we'll get into how it has some magical realism to it. So first and foremost, we get to hear about several characters in Oscar's family. We hear about Oscar, of course. We get to hear several chapters on his sister Lola, who is just this sort of just powerful, beautiful, strong, compelling young woman who has to sort of make it on her own. And her really challenging, almost ridiculous relationship with her mother. Diaz paints the familial relationship for Dominican Republic kids as one of conflict, really, between the child and the parent. It often talks about how the mother is just really strict and hard on the kid and what have you. Now, I don't know. I've never been a part of this culture, but it was fascinating to read this book and get a glimpse into really what it would be like to grow up as a young male in the Dominican Republic. We also hear about Oscar's mother, Belly, who was orphaned and completely over-sexualized and really just has every reason to be angry at the world and is, in fact, angry at the world. She takes a lot of it out on her kids, Lola and Oscar. She really struggles with so many things, and it is heartbreaking and encouraging and terrifying to sort of go through her pages and experience life as she lived it. We get to hear about La Inca, who's the grandmother, and so many of these different things that kind of come into play. It's just this fascinating family story that you get to walk through, and you get to see this multi-generational view of a family and how they came to be. I think that's a fascinating thing because I was an only child. And as an only child, it was just me and mom. I don't have a real strong connection to any of my extended family, which is unfortunate. So this view into bigger families and how they interact and the politics of it and the games that they get up to and how you sort of stay together as a family and not explode. It's just this fascinating view, and Junot does a great job of it. Now, what does this have to do with magical realism? Well, the first few pages of the book talk about something that the Dominican Republic holds near and dear to their culture, which is called the fuku. F-U-K-U. Sounds a lot like something else, I know. But the fuku really is almost a curse that every Dominican Republic person, anybody from the DR, has to put up with. And not just them, but everybody. But this culture, potentially coming from Africa, was adopted by the DR. And the idea is simple, that there is, once you get a fuku, and you're going to get a fuku, there is something that is enchanting your impending doom. And you're going to have to struggle with this fuku all of your life, potentially. So for you, your fuku might be that you were born with a disease, or perhaps you are married to somebody who beats you and just is awful to you. Or maybe your fuku is that you're raising children who won't listen and are just complete animals in the house, right? But the fuku is this supernatural element that hangs over the story the entire time. Now, with Oscar Wilde being the main character, this young man who just does not fit in the Dominican male world, he clearly has a fuku. He can't get a girlfriend. He is a total mess in every way, shape, and form. And you want to root for this guy. You just want some girl to kiss him. And he's just this sort of beautiful, awkward soul. But that is the point of The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, is that we all have a fuku. We're all dealing with challenge. We're all dealing with hardship. And you're not a special snowflake, by the way. Hard things will come. And it is really important that you not only learn to face your hardships with courage, but that you learn to work through them as a family. Now, I will give you a warning here. If you are sensitive as a reader, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde may not be for you. With it having that strong sort of Latin vibe to it, it is really, I don't know how to say it. There's a lot of conversation about sex in there. There's a lot of conversation about a specific gangster in there. And there's a lot of stuff that just really promotes the prostitution and everything else. And it's a challenging book to see what this family has to go through in order to just find some stability. But the voice of the author does not soften the sexual language. It's definitely as though he is a young Dominican male Republic guy talking about, female sexuality. So be prepared for that. But it is a very good book. And I think if you're interested in seeing how other cultures have had to come along, this is a great one. And it got me looking up this dictator Trujillo and the things that he did in society. And I had no idea. So that's it for this week, everybody. I hope you found that insightful. We learned about allegories as well as magical realism, and I gave you a book recommendation for The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. It's just a fun book to read. Now, if you find this episode helpful, I want to thank you for stopping by here in the podcast world and listening. It means a lot to me that you're here. We're building a community of people that love books. I think that is something that can be revived. A lot of people say that reading is dying, that books are going away, and that we're just being consumed by internet and television, and I think that is garbage. I think that books are just as alive today as they ever have been. I believe that they are life-changing and can help you regain focus in your life and help you gain self-confidence and a clear worldview as you learn about these other cultures and as you learn about other people. It can help you gain more empathy and more kindness and more courage as you go out and live your own life. I think books are the greatest gift we've ever been given. And so with that, if you found this episode helpful, I would sure appreciate any chance you could take to head over to Apple, iTunes, in the podcast directory, search up the Readable Podcast. And if you don't mind, leave me a review and let me know how I'm doing. We're up to 50 now. 50 reviews is a really big deal. I remember when I was trying to get our very first one, it's such a challenge to get those in. For all of you that have done that, thank you so much. And until next week, as always, remember to read slowly, take notes, and apply the ideas. I'll see you next time. If you'd like to take your reading to the next level, then head on over to thereadwellpodcast.com. There you'll find daily posts on how to read well. You'll also get access to all of my book notes and tools for becoming a better reader. And as always, don't forget to read slowly, take notes, and apply the ideas. Thank you for listening to the Read Well podcast.